Hi, today we're going to talk about storytelling with dynamic subtitles in Power BI. Subtitles are a great way to communicate an insight that we want to highlight to our report users. It's a bit of an underrated technique, but it's one that can take all your reports from good to great. This video is part of a series where we look into different techniques on how to create stunning KPI visuals. If you want to know more, take a look at the links in the description. In the description, you will also find a starter file that you can use to follow along with the exercise. Now, enough talking, let's start building. In the starter file, I already have created an outline of my subtitle measure. And that's usually the way that I start. So I first of all make a reflection of what is the story that I want to tell, what is the insight I want to communicate. And then I just write it as plain text. So for example, here with the first one, I want to state what is the movement of the inventory. So has it increased or decreased and by which amount? So let's leave this outline with the placeholders that I have here as it is, and we'll already add it to the visual to have a feel of how it looks. Select our visual, go to the formatting pane, then under general you have title, enable the subtitle and expand it, and then rather than having a static text we will use the conditional formatting, and then our field value is the KPI card subtitle, and then you can see I have my subtitle added here. So we still need to fill in the placeholders, and what we will also have to do is to make sure that there is no overlap with any of the visual elements, because some of my subtitles here, they go over 2 lines. So we also need to add a little bit of a trick to push down all those visual elements by increasing the height of the y-axis. But first of all, we're going to start by filling in the placeholders so that we get an actual subtitle that is communicating the data and the insight that we want to bring forward. And then we're going to work on cleaning up the visual and pushing down the visual elements. And if you go back to our subtitle measure, we're going to take a look at all the placeholders that we need to replace with the actual values. And let's start with the date. So the end date, that is a measure that I already have. So in my time horizon, in the previous exercise, we have already defined the period end date. We also have a period start date, but it does not necessarily have a value. So that is a date that we are calculating based on the selection. So we take the period end date, for example, if it's 1 year, that we do 365 days prior to the end date. But we don't necessarily know that there is a date within my fact inventory table. So what I'm going to do is create a new measure that is just going to give us the earliest date available in my data set that is later than my period start date. So it can be the same as my period start date, but it does not necessarily have to be that. And it's important that we pick that date, because if we're also looking for amounts and we have a date on which there are no transactions, then it will be 0. And my inventory data here is on a weekly basis. So if we pick the wrong date, there is no data being displayed. So I'm gonna add a new helper measure, which is gonna calculate the minimum date key available within my selected period. So I'm gonna say, look for the minimum date key for all my fact inventory records where the date key is greater than or equal to my period start date. And then if you take a look at minimum date key, what is the value? You can see it's the 27th of December. And if I have my period start date, that is the 26th. So it's important that we have this alternative, because here my data is on a weekly basis. Next, I'm gonna add the dates into my actual subtitle. I'm gonna create a variable both for the period start date and end date. It's equal to my minimum date key. And then my variable period end date is equal to the measure that we have previously created, so period end date. And I'm not going to inject them as dates itself, but I'm going to apply some formatting so that it becomes a formatted text string. So let's format it, and then I want to display it as days, then a short month description, and then the year. Do the same for my period end date. Now our variables are ready, and then we can start replacing the values here. Start date, and then I also have my period end date, and then I also have the end date here in my fourth KPI, and on KPI 2 as well. So let's save the measure and take a look at how it's displayed. This is looking okay. Now we're gonna add in the amounts, so my start amount and my end amount. Let's create two measures to calculate those. First of all, I have my start on-hand value, which is just gonna calculate the sum of my on-hand value, where my date key is equal to my minimum date key. And I will do the same for the end on-hand value, so the sum of on-hand value, where my date key is equal to my period end date. Let's add those to the subtitle. I'm going to create two more variables to store those amounts and apply formatting to them. My start on-hand value is equal to my measure that I have created. Wrap it into a format function. I want to display my values in millions. I'm going to divide it by 1 million and then apply my format string. We'll do the same for the end on-hand value, and then we're going to replace the placeholders. So now the placeholders have been replaced with the actual values. Let's save the measure and take a look at our subtitle. That looks okay. Let's add 1 million in there, so it's clear that those are millions. Let's save the measure again. That's starting to look good. Now I also need to add my movement amount and whether it was an increase or a decrease. Go to our subtitle one more time. My movement is a simple calculation of my end on-hand value minus my start on-hand value. Let's also replace the placeholder here. And then the last placeholder that we need to fill in for our first KPI is whether the movement is an increase or a decrease in total inventory value. So we're going to create an extra variable, movement type. If my start on-hand value is greater than my end, then it means that there is a decrease. Otherwise, my total inventory value has increased. Replace the placeholder, and then the subtitle for our first KPI should be ready. So this is looking good. Of course, for the other KPIs, there are still some placeholders that need to be replaced. I would encourage you to try it on your own to see if you can complete that exercise. I will also have a solution file linked in the description of the video. Now we will first switch to removing that overlap of the sub. To do that, we need to increase the range of our y-axis. If we select our visual and we go to the formatting pane and then the y-axis, and here is actually the secondary y-axis for this first KPI because this is the line measure. So those are displayed on the secondary one, and then the bars are on the regular y-axis, so the primary y-axis. Let's take a look at the secondary y-axis. Here everything is still set to auto, so Power BI is going to define automatically what is a suitable range to display our data. And to do that, we need to define what is my maximum data point, so what is my highest stock value here in this case. So we're going to create a measure that is going to calculate the maximum amount of inventory, my total stock value, across my period selected. If I create a new measure, my maximum sum on-hand value, I'm going to use the max function with double X, and then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to filter my inventory records where my date key is higher than or equal to my period start date, and then I'm going to calculate the sum of my on-hand value. Double check that that calculation is correct. Let's make it a table. You can see it's 128 million, and then in the chart I can see I can get exactly the same value there. So now we have calculated my maximum amount of inventory across the period. We'll use that value to push everything down. I'm going to create a new measure. I'm going to call this one the max of of my secondary y-axis. We'll also do the same for the primary one. I'm going to add a variable called multiplication factor, and that is going to define how much we're moving down our axis. I'm going to set it to 1.05, so I'm going to add 5% to the value. And by using a variable, then further down in the definition of the measure, we can quite easily play with that value and get it to a range that fits our needs. Then I'm gonna add a variable for my maximum range that is gonna be equal to a switch function, and I'm gonna look at the selected value of my KPI. If my KPI is equal to KPI 1, then I want to have my maximum sum of my on-hand value, so the measure that we created just before, and I'm gonna multiply that by our multiplication factor. And then I'm gonna return that max range. Save the measure, select our visual, go to the formatting pane, secondary y-axis, and then here on the maximum, apply conditional formatting, and our field value will be the maximum of my secondary y-axis. And then immediately we can see that our graph gets pushed down a little bit. Let's go to our next KPI and apply the same. Here our top line is the same as the first KPI, so that's also our total inventory value. So we can here simply update the measure of the secondary y-axis, make a copy, and then also when KPI 2 is selected, I want to have the same maximum applied. Now it's moving down. So that's working, but something that I also want to change here on the excess stock view is that my right axis is starting around 35 million. So it looks here that my optimal stock is almost 0, but it's giving me that false image because my axis is not starting at 0. So here I want to make sure that my axis starts at 0 so that you have a better view of how the optimal stock is related to my total stock levels. We will do something similar, but rather than setting a maximum, we will set the minimum of that axis. Let's create a new measure, call this one my minimum of my secondary y-axis, create a switch function, and then also I'm going to look what is the selected value of my KPI. If my KPI is equal to the second KPI, then I want to return a 0. We go back to our visual, then here in the formatting pane, go to the secondary y-axis, and then go to the minimum, apply conditional formatting, select my fields, and then we're gonna take the minimum of my secondary y-axis. And this is, in my opinion, a better way to visualize my optimal versus my total stock. And then now you know how to do storytelling with dynamic subtitles. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at how you can use error bars to take your visuals to the next level. If you want to know more about that technique, click the link above and I will see you in the next one.